Hello and thank you for watching. This is STSC back again with LEGO Transformers Revenge of the Fallen Devastator. This video has been a long time coming. At this point, I think this MOC is roughly 5 years old, and it took me this long to finally make a video about it. But now it's finally time for me to talk about these guys. A few things off the bat. None of these transform individually. That might be disappointing, but honestly, at this scale, I don't think you could squeeze robot modes out of these guys. Or at least not good robot modes. So I opted not to include them. Otherwise, there were two key features I wanted to capture on this model. Firstly, all 9 Constructicons are present here, which is of course the 7 usuals, plus the 2 unnamed characters that only briefly appeared in the film. And secondly, there's no parts forming, which is to say that Devastator's head is included in the transformation, and no separate pieces are required to make him combine. So, without further ado, I'm going to take a look at these guys from smallest to largest. To start things off, here we have the smallest and easily simplest of the Constructicons, and his name is kind of up for debate. Personally, I call him Scrapmetal, but I know a lot of people call him Buckethead. Officially, he is the unnamed bulldozer that forms Devastator's hand, and that name confusion is probably the most interesting part about him, honestly. Because build-wise, he's pretty darn simple. He is a very blocky, tiny little bulldozer. I do think he looks pretty nice for how simple he is, but let's be honest, there's just not much going on here. And before moving on, here's a minifigure for scale. Up next, we have Payload, who, like Scrapmetal, also does not have an official name. Officially, he is the unnamed yellow dump truck, but personally, I call him Payload based off of the yellow Longhaul repaint from Hunt for the Decepticons. I don't think this guy is as successful as a micro vehicle compared to Scrapmetal. The biggest issue is that the dumping bed is connected to the cab, which is necessary for how he transforms. And then there's the unfortunate fact that his combiner port has to stick out the side and makes half of his dumping bed light gray, which doesn't look all that great. So yeah, this is probably my least favorite of the Constructicons, but for how tiny he is, I don't think it's that big a deal. And before moving on, here we have a minifigure for scale. And here we have our third Constructicon, and like the first two, his name is also in question. This is Rampage, but if you prefer, could also be Skipjack. Both names are pretty much equally valid. In the original toys, which personally I grew up with, both the yellow and red bulldozers were called Rampage. So, personally, I like to call this guy Rampage. Of course, now, in Studio Series, they've renamed him to be Skipjack and kept the red Rampage to be Rampage. So, if you want, he can be Skipjack, but personally, I'm going to call him Rampage. And now we have finally got the name baggage out of the way. From here forward, all of the Constructicons have clear, concise names that are not in question. But before that, we can take a closer look at Rampage, and you can see he's got pretty simple little treads, and he's got his plow here with the little hydraulics on the side. I kind of like how these studs here almost look like they could be tiny little exhaust pipes or smokestacks. And all in all, he's very, very simple. He really is kind of just the next step up from Scrapmetal in terms of complexity. And he doesn't really have that much going on, like most of these little guys. If you really want to, you could kind of adjust the angle of the plow or kind of move it around a bit, but I don't think it looks very good, and I don't really see why you'd want to do that. And before we move on to the next Constructicon, here we have a minifigure for scale. Our fourth Constructicon is Hightower, who is a little bit inaccurate. If you come to the back here, the counterweight on the back should, I believe, be 2 larger blocks that are closer in width to the tread base, but personally I think this looks good enough, and it helps with the combined mode. In this mode, his crane is articulated, so it can go up and down, and you have to be careful because there is a ball joint in the center there, so you can easily move that instead, so Kind of have to hold it from up front and move it. And then the hook on the end can also be pivoted. So you can kind of pose him a little bit, though it's so short, you're not really going to be able to lift that much with this crane because, well, like the rest of them, he's pretty tiny. Speaking of which, before we move on to our next Constructicon, here is a minifigure for scale. Now we're on to Mixmaster, who has the unfortunate job of having to try and form Devastator's head. Though to help lessen that burden, most of the head actually comes from Scavenger this time. And you'll notice here there's only a little bit tucked in the back, which does unfortunately kind of stick out, and it's a bit of an eyesore, but considering the alternative is parts forming, I think this definitely is the better route. Unfortunately, although it might look like it can, his cement drum is not able to turn, because the rest of the truck is actually connected by it, so if you were to try to, well, you'd be breaking the truck in half. And for scale, here's a minifigure. And here we have Longhaul, who might actually be the most functional of the Constructicons, since he can both roll, and he has a working dumping bed, so if you want, you can put him in a dumping pose. Other than that, there's not really much to say about him, so here he is with a minifigure for scale. And nearing the end we have Scrapper, who's looking a little bit long, mostly to help facilitate his combined mode. Unfortunately, if you turn him around, his combiner peg kind of just hangs off the back there. In this mode, Scrapper is able to raise and lower his shovel, but you have to be careful because the side chunks are very easy to dislocate. And before moving on, here we have a minifigure for scale. And second to last, we have Overload, who does have a couple of small issues. Firstly, you'll notice he does have his combiner ball joints kind of just sticking out. And if you look at him from the top, you'll notice his rear axles are less wide than his front axles. In this mode, you're able to articulate the dump truck a little bit, and if you really wanted to, you could even remove it and convert him into a more standard four-wheeled truck. And before we move on to the big guy, here we have a minifigure for scale. And last but not least, we have the biggest and my favorite Constructicon, Scavenger. There's something about this alt mode that I've always loved. Just a big red brick with white stripes. I don't know, something about it just does it for me. And I definitely think this LEGO version captures that design. Unfortunately, due to how Devastator's head transforms, the upper section of the vehicle is not able to articulate, and the arm is a bit limited in its range of motion. But you can do some digging poses, since it can rotate a little bit, and he has an elbow sort of joint, and I guess a hand joint, if that's how you want to look at it. And before we move on to the main event, one last size comparison. Here we have Scavenger with a minifigure. And now we've looked at all of the Constructicons individually, so now it's time to combine. Rampage and Payload are in their leg mode and ready to combine. Longhaul is in his leg mode and ready to combine. Scrapmetal and Hightower are in arm mode and ready to combine. Scrapper is in arm mode and ready to combine. Scavenger, Overload, and Mixmaster are in torso mode and ready to combine. And here we have Devastator all combined in robot mode. And I think he captures the spirit of the design pretty well. Honestly, there aren't that many specific details that I implemented here. Like, for example, I don't think a lot of the wheels are actually where they're supposed to be. But on this design, I don't think that's really all that important. Since the real design is so busy and on such a large scale, I think it's okay to not focus on the small details and instead focus on making him really feel like Devastator. Of course, that's not to say I didn't try to make him accurate at all. You'll notice that the front of Mixmaster's cab actually is up top where it's supposed to be. Of course, the foot is formed from Rampage's treads, like it's supposed to be. And both of his hands are accurately made out of buckets, instead of having a hand just come out of Hightower somewhere. And turning him around, you'll see that he has a literal dump truck. I mentioned earlier that when designing this creation, I really wanted to avoid parts forming. A lot of LEGO Devastators have to have the head added on after the fact, but on this one it actually folds up into the components. And I think given that functionality, it looks pretty good. Looking at his profile reveals one of my only issues with this model. I feel like his proportions are just a little bit off. Something about how far forward the shoulder connects and how long the arms are just doesn't look quite right to me. As is, I definitely think it looks good, but sometimes it can look a little weird. For a size comparison, here we have a minifigure. And Sideswipe, who of course is totally out of scale, but still is kind of dwarfed by him. Now there's an interesting discrepancy between how Devastator's toys appear and how he appeared in the movie. In the film, Devastator was depicted as a quadruped, mostly walking on all fours like a giant dog. However, most of the merchandise produced of his design has shown him as a biped. Personally, I'll always prefer the quadrupedal look that was shown in the movie. But if you prefer the more humanoid look of the toys, this Devastator actually can assume that pose. So it's time to transform. And now we have Devastator in a more toy-style bipedal pose. And personally, I don't think it looks that good. I think it definitely shows that this guy was built to be a quadruped, and he's able to assume this pose completely by accident. I think the way his neck juts out is really awkward in this mode. But it is something the figure can do, and I figured it was worthwhile showing it. And it also makes it easier to show his articulation. Unfortunately, Devastator's neck is locked due to transformation, so you're not going to get any movement out of his head. However, his jaws are attached by 2 axes of motion, so they can open kind of this way and this way. So you can kind of get him into a bit of a pose like he's about to start sucking up the desert. Both of Devastator's shoulders have 2 joints. The Technic pin left over from Scavenger's bucket arm, and the ball joint where the limbs connect. However, otherwise, their arms articulate a little bit differently. Both of them have this ball joint at the center, but it's significantly hindered on Hightower, considering the crane is right in the way of its motion, so you're not really going to get too much movement out of it. Because of this, Hightower has a second elbow here where Scrapmetal attaches. You can use that as a swivel as well, and you can kind of get a little under a 90-degree bend from it. And of course, you can also fiddle with the fingers. Scrapper has the same ball-jointed elbow, but his is a lot more functional, considering he doesn't have as much bulk to him. And instead of the second elbow, he has kind of a wrist hinge here, which also can work as a swivel. And once again, the fingers can be moved around. From the waist down, Devastator has 2 ball joints at the hips. However, they can sometimes bang into the treads above them, which makes them a bit limited. So, depending on which orientation you have them at, they can get varying degrees of range. In the quadrupedal mode, they actually get more range because there is less bulk above them, so they can kind of go outwards more. Then they have a knee kind of here, if you could consider that a knee, which is actually what you have to bend to put him into quadrupedal mode. So when he's a quadruped, his legs are like this, which of course you could do for the biped as well. I just like to make him have taller legs just to accentuate the differences between the 2 modes. Beyond that, the legs don't really have any useful articulation. You can kind of get knees out of them and kind of wiggle the feet, but how often are you going to use Devastator's knees? So, I don't think it really matters. Of course, you can also swivel the feet out if you want a more dynamic pose. So they both do have a swivel, which is nice. But, of course, when it comes to Devastator, you're mostly just going to have him standing there, posing his arms. So the focus here is just having a solid standing base. While I'm still really happy with how this build looks, I think its age is starting to show. There are areas of the build I definitely think I could improve upon, given the modern pieces I have at my disposal and the techniques I've learned since building him. So who knows, maybe in the not-too-distant future I'll be showing you Devastator version 2. But for now, I think I'm still content with this guy. And hopefully you like him too. And that's all I have to say about him, so I'll see you next time.